In this video, I'm going to show you an approach to branching and merging with Power Platform solutions when you're using source control as the source of truth. So the scenario here is that I have two different developers or makers developing in two different environments. One environment is called MarkSC ALM Demo Dev 1, and the other one is called ALM Demo Dev 2. But if you notice, if we look at both environments, we're working on the same solution. And instead of the environment being the source of truth, source control is the source of truth because we have everything that represents the source code for this solution in this Git repository in GitHub. And don't let the title of the solution and the GitHub repository confuse you. While the example I show will be Power Virtual Agents, the same approaches can be applied to other solution components in the Power Platform solution system. And so to make it easier to navigate the code for the demo purposes, I've gone ahead and cloned this repo locally and opened it up in Visual Studio. And we can see here that in my file content.json here, I've got some code for a change that has been made, and it's in the main branch here. And one of the key principles in traditional development that uses source control as a source of truth is to create short-lived branches, commit often, and pull request often. And in the code first world, the process you would typically take is you would come here, you would synchronize your changes to make sure you've got the latest and greatest from your main branch. And then you would come in here and you would create a new branch off of your main branch. Let's say it's, my work item 123 or your handle, etc. So I might call this DKDT 123 because that's the work item that I'm going to be working on. I would come in here, I would create this, I would do my work, I would push my changes to the remote repository, and I would submit a pull request. I would try to get that pull request reviewed as quickly as possible, and then merged in the main branch, and then other people would repeat that same process. And the concept is that you're always trying to work off of the main branch plus your changes as much as possible. And that's always the best way to minimize merge conflicts. And that's the case for code first development. And it's also the case for low code development with Power Platform and solutions when you're using source control as your source of truth. But in Power Platform, a lot of what you do doesn't start with code first. It starts within the Power Platform across the different low code services like Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agents, etc. And in fact, if you look at what's in the main branch here, and you look at what's in the service, and I come over here to what's in my dev environment, as well as my dev 2 environment, you will notice that the text here has the words dev in it, whereas in the main branch, we have the words even older again. And so clearly, my dev environment is out of sync with the main branch. And to follow that principle of pull down the latest from the main branch before you start that work, conceptually, we need to get this code into my environment. And so to do that, I'm going to come over here and run a GitHub workflow that I've authored called delete and import unmanaged solution. So this workflow takes your solution name. So this will be PVA ALM, which is the same as this name right here. And then it'll take your environment endpoint, which is the same as this right here. And then in my case, I want to get into my environment the latest and greatest from the main branch. And so I'll click run workflow here. And once this is done running, I'll walk you through at a high level what the workflow does. All right, so I've clicked into the workflow and you can see that at a high level, what it does is it deletes the unmanaged solution and the unmanaged components from the environment. This effectively leaves us with a environment cleaned out of our unmanaged solution and components while still maintaining things like connections and environment settings. And while ideally we could just reset the environment, today the process of reestablishing all of those environment settings and reestablishing connections is hard to automate. So instead, we keep the environment and just clean out the unmanaged solution and components. Then we do a build off of the main branch and we deploy it as an unmanaged solution to the environment. And during the deploy process, we are setting things like environment variables and connection references. And then finally, we go ahead and import configuration migration data, essentially data in Dataverse that needs to be in the development environment for the developer or the maker to be productive. And then finally, because we are importing this solution as a service principal, we need to turn on flows. And now if I come back to my dev environment here and I refresh the solution, and I open up my bot, I go ahead and edit that topic. You will see that we now have the text that represents that code from the main branch. All right, so while I was recording this video, I actually ran into an issue with this delete and import unmanaged solution and components workflow right here. And the issue I ran into is that the GitHub Actions, which is backed by the Power Platform CLI, so both the Power Platform CLI and the GitHub Actions that allows you to delete a solution will time out with larger solutions. And so we're actively working with various internal teams to improve this experience. And so if you run this workflow and it fails during the delete process, then you're better off separating this automation process into a few steps. So what I've done is I've created a workflow called convert to unmanaged. And so for the second environment, we will go through that slightly more manual, but still automated process. Because remember in the beginning of the video, I showed you that the second development environment also doesn't have the latest code. So what we're trying to mimic now is a scenario where two developers or makers start to make changes in their environments based off of an initial code base from main. And so I'm developer number two, I'm coming in, I'm trying to get my work done, and I know in order to minimize merge conflicts, the first thing I need to do is get the latest from main into my developer environment. All right, so to do that, we're going to run this workflow called convert unmanaged to managed. And again, what you'll see next essentially separates this overall process that was fully automated, delete and import unmanaged solution. We'll separate it into an automated process to convert the unmanaged solution to managed. Then we'll manually go into make.powerapps.com and delete the managed solution. And then we'll call import unmanaged solution to get the latest from main into my dev environment. All right, so let's go ahead and run this. And similarly to before, we're going to specify the PVA ALM solution. And this time we want to get our second development environment ready to have the latest and greatest from main. So I'll run this workflow. And this workflow is going to take a few minutes to run. And so I'll edit out the time it takes to run the workflow, and then we'll pick up when it's done. All right, so the workflow completed running. Now if we go over to make.powerapps.com, notice we're in that dev2 environment. We can see that our solution has been converted to a managed solution. And whereas before the automation would handle deleting it, to work around the known issue with the GitHub action and the Power Platform CLI, otherwise known as PAC CLI, we're going to manually delete this. And what this will do Just as before, it will delete the unmanaged solution and all of its contents, including data that is in Dataverse tables that are part of the unmanaged solution. All right, so now our managed solution and all of its components, including the data in Dataverse tables, are deleted from the environment. So we can now go back to our GitHub workflow and we can run import unmanaged solution. And so this time we'll follow the same pattern. We'll bring it into our dev2 environment. And just like our other environment, we want to get the latest from main into this environment. And then at that point, both environments will be in sync with main. All right, so this is going to take a few minutes, so I will pause my video and we will resume when it's done. If we go back to this environment here and I refresh, you'll see that we have an unmanaged solution. And if I look at the chatbot and I edit it, go to topics, authoring canvas, scroll down here, we'll see that now we also have the same confirmation that we have the code from the main branch. All right, so now let's mimic these two different developers or makers doing work in two isolated environments and getting them into the source control system. All right, so now we're back in the dev or dev1 environment. We were previously in the dev2 environment. And so both of these environments are now in sync with the main branch in the Git repo. And so now we're going to come in and make some changes. So I'll come in, I'll select the chatbot here. I'll edit the topic. And let's change this to dev to represent changes from this environment, and I'll save that. And now we'll come over to GitHub again, and we'll run a new workflow. We'll run the export unpack commit solution workflow. And so PVALM is our solution. We're going to export it from the dev environment. And in this case, we're going to set up what's called a pull request. So we know that the code in the environment started with source code from the main branch. And so we're going to create a new branch, and we'll call this from dev, but this would typically be something like, again, dkdt-123, something that signifies this is a branch that has your work item in it. People often call this a feature branch or a work item branch, an issue branch, etc. Use whatever terminology you prefer, but we'll just call this from dev and give it a commit comment from dev, and we'll run this workflow. All right, so roughly in parallel, the developer maker in dev environment 1 is doing something at the same time that the person in dev environment 2 is doing. And so let's just mimic that. In this case, we'll say dev 2, and maybe we'll scroll up and we'll say hello Bellevue with a couple extra exclamation points. And I'll save this. And remember, this bot is in the dev2 environment. So I'll click save. And we can test this out. So I'll say hello world. And if I click Seattle, we'll see dev2 there. If I do it again, hello world, click Bellevue, and we see the extra exclamation points. All right, so we'll go back over to GitHub and mimic that other developer or maker doing some work and wanting to get their work into source control. So same thing, PVA ALM, except this case we're going to get the code out of dev2 because this is the maker for dev2, and we'll call this from dash dev2 and from dash dev2 as the commit message. And I'll click run workflow. All right, we can see the other one already ran. And so let's go take a look at what happened while this one is running. So we go over to code now. You will see that I now have two branches. We have a branch called from dev. So I'm going to compare and create a pull request. And I'll click create pull request. And we can notice that while the checks are running, we can see that the branch has no conflicts with the base branch. So we're in good shape so far. So now if we go back over to code again, we can see that we also have the dev2 branch, and we can create a pull request for that. And again, so far so good, no merge conflicts. So what have we done here? We have two different developers working in two different environments, dev1 and dev2. They're taking a source control centric approach with developer environment isolation, which means they're not developing in the same environment. They're using source control as the source of truth. We got the latest code into each environment based off the main branch. We did work in each environment, and then we exported the changes from both of those environments as source code, each in their own feature branch or working branch or issue branch. And then we've created pull requests, which in Git terms is the review process as you're putting work into separate branches and trying to bring that work into your main branch. All right, we can see that both of our pull requests have now passed their checks, which includes a PR build and validation to make sure that what's in the PR branch is buildable and deployable code. But it also includes standard Git integration to let you know that there are no merge conflicts. So I'm dev1, right? This is the from dev branch, and I've gotten my review done first. My teammate has looked at my code, looked at the changes, and they can see that I've changed the value in parentheses from even dash older dash again to dev. So let's say the code reviewer approves this, and I'm going to squash and merge. And I can delete the branch. And then as dev1, I can repeat that process because it may be another few days until I've got more work to do. Maybe I've got some documentation work, maybe I'm taking a few days off. And so it's highly likely that what's in my dev environment is going to be out of sync with what's in the main branch when I pick my work back up. One of the things you'll notice is because this was merged into the main branch, now the solution and the changes that have been merged into the main branch are deploying to the user acceptance testing environment. And if I come back to my pull request, I click on it, you'll notice that I can no longer merge this. And this is to be expected because this is how traditional code first branching and merging with developer isolation works. because both the developer from Dev 1 and Dev 2 based their work off of what was in main, and Dev 1 got changes into main faster. Now Dev 2 has to reconcile their changes, essentially resolve conflicts. There's a couple things you can do here. You could click this resolve conflicts button and then use the GitHub built-in UI. But for more complex scenarios, I prefer to use Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to come back to Visual Studio Code here. And the first thing we need to do is get the latest from main because there's new code in main. And then we need to also pull down the code that's from this from dev2 branch. All right, so now locally on my workstation, I have both the latest from main and the latest from dev2. And the way you resolve conflicts is you come over to this source control tab here, and you select branch, merge branch. And we want to merge from main into this branch because main now has more updated code than this from dev2 branch. So we'll go ahead and select main. Notice the first thing it does. It tells us that we've got merge conflicts. All right, so in this file, what Visual Studio is telling me is that the current change coming in from the pull request has 3 exclamation points. The changes in main only have 1. And so I'm going to decide to accept the incoming changes, i.e. the changes in main. And then down here, instead of accepting the incoming changes, the changes in main, I want to preserve my changes coming from dev2. So we'll accept the current changes. And then you'll see over in the well here where we have additional merge conflicts. You can also do a command palette, Control-Shift-P, and find the next merge conflict. Do it again, and we can look at the different values and determine which ones are safe to merge. And in my case, I'm looking at all these and they look good. So I'm going to say Control-Shift-P, merge, accept all current changes. And then we're going to stage those changes. We'll do the same thing for the next file. And we're going to accept all current changes. We'll stage that. And then we're going to commit this. Now you might be tempted to click the Sync Changes button, but the way that the Sync Changes button works in Visual Studio is it pulls down changes from the remote and overwrites changes locally. That's not what we want to do because we just made a bunch of changes locally to ensure what's in the remote branch doesn't have merge conflicts. So instead of clicking Sync Changes, what you're going to want to do is click this little ellipsis next to source control and click Push. And now, if we come back over to our pull request, we can see that the build checks are running again, but we can also see that we no longer have merge conflicts. All right, so now our build and validation checks have passed. So we can now squash and merge and delete that branch. And the best thing to do is come back to Visual Studio and go ahead and switch to your main branch because now the main branch in the remote has new code. Refresh this. And I always delete the branch that I used locally to help me resolve merge conflicts. And similarly as before, you'll notice that we've got a build deploying to our user acceptance test environment. All right, so it's finished deploying to our user acceptance test environment. So let's go over and look. We can see that we in fact have a new build in our UAT environment. I come in here, we can see that the Cloudflow is turned on, the connection reference is set, and our chatbot. If we go into the topic, click on it, go to the authoring canvas, we can see that we have the single exclamation for Bellevue based on the merge conflict we resolved, and we can see that we have dev2 based on the merge conflict we resolved.